Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining our talk today. My name is Aisha Dixon. I'm the director of the Emeriti Retirees Relations Center at UCLA. And we're glad to host this program in conjunction with the UCLA Retirees Association and also the UCLA Emeriti Association. Just some housekeeping. I'm going to not allow people to unmute themselves. So everyone's going to be muted right now. And then when there's time for Q&A, I will allow questions either in the chat or you can use the reaction feature here to raise your hand, or once it's opened, you can just ask your question. So I am going to turn this over Cedarbaum so he can introduce our special guest speaker today. Steve, let me find your little box. Where's your face? There you go. Okay.
Thank you. I want to begin this introduction with a metaphor. All of you know the story of Superman, and Superman exists in two forms or two roles. One is Superman with the superpowers, and the other is Clark Kent, who's in this case mild-mannered but completely separate identity from Superman. Well, today's speaker is in fact an individual with two identities, but the metaphor breaks down because both of Carole's identities are super. Carole Goldberg is known to most of us in her varying leadership roles on campus, and I don't think I need to detail them all, but of course we know her best as this group as the Vice Chancellor for Academic something or other. I get that wrong. Personnel, and I keep getting corrected by Bonnie. But in that role and many other leadership roles on campus. But this other side of Superwoman is her professional role, for which she is equally well known and renowned. And that is as an expert on Indian affairs, particularly legal aspects, but I'm sure by this time, many others. She's really world-renowned in this, I guess nationally renowned. People in Europe wouldn't care about American Indians. But anyway, nationally renowned, and she's going to share some of her unique observations with us. And the title of her talk today is Indigenous Peoples of the Greater Los Angeles Area. And Carole, we're very excited to hear your talk. Welcome and thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's wonderful to at least be on screen with so many longtime colleagues and friends. And of course, to be associated with the Maritime Retirees Relations Center, which was a part of the domain of the Vice Chancellor academic personnel for those 5 years in which I served. And I know firsthand all of the fabulous contributions made to the UCLA campus by the members of these two associations. And really, we would not be the great UCLA we are without it. So it's wonderful to be with you. As Steve has pointed out, my work over the now nearly 50 years that I've been at UCLA has been in the field of Native American law, both the legal systems of the Native nations themselves and the legal regime that the United States engages in its dealings with indigenous peoples. And the presentation that I'm giving today is the outgrowth of work that has been done not only by me, but by another now UCLA Emeritus faculty member, my colleague and also husband, Professor of Sociology Emeritus Dwayne Champagne. We began this work, I must say, long before we were Emeriti. This work is the product of more than 12 years of research. And the work has been done totally in collaboration and at the instance of a local non-federally recognized tribe, the Fernandino Tataviam Band of Mission Indians, whose ancestral territory can best be described as the greater Los Angeles area. This tribe had associations with both Dwayne and me before we began this work. So I was teaching a clinic called Tribal Legal Development, and the tribe had come to our clinic for assistance in producing their most recent version of their tribal constitution, which I and my students worked on for them. And Dwayne, who is a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, a tribe in north central North Dakota, of course, many of you know, was for many years the director of UCLA's American Indian Studies Center. He was also the chair of the Los Angeles City and County Native American Commission, and in that capacity got to know the leaders of the Fernandino Tataviam Band of Mission Indians. So they came to us for assistance in undertaking the considerable work associated with a petition to the federal government for recognition. And let me just add that federal recognition isn't what creates an indigenous tribe. It is simply the United States acknowledging a government-to-government relationship with a group of indigenous people. And there is an elaborate set of federal regulations associated with how one must document the petition for federal recognition. It requires a demonstration of social and political continuity from periods of early colonization up to the present. So breaks in continuity can be very damaging to a federal recognition petition, and immense amounts of documentation are required, often putting huge burdens on Native peoples because they don't necessarily keep minutes when they get together. That's not how they would normally operate. So we undertook, beginning about 12 years ago, to collect as much material as we possibly could and to craft a petition for this tribe. And one thing I must add is that there are tribes that have done this successfully, not a large number, and not very many in California, for reasons I can get into. But typically when a tribe engages some researchers to help with this, the cost can run into the millions of dollars. The Fernandino Tataviam, however, early on made an arrangement with us where we were encouraged to produce an academic book as a result of the work we were doing. And so while Dwayne and I did need some financial support from the tribe to hire research assistants and for other research purposes, travel and so on, this was basically a cut rate operation because there was this beneficial coincidence between our academic pursuits and the desires of the tribe. And of course, we had to make it clear to them that we had to follow the evidence wherever it led. This was not going to be curtailed or in any way distorted based on the fact that the tribe had an interest. So what did we do? We did archival research in government archives, in private libraries. We did genealogical research extensively in Spanish mission records and elsewhere. We did oral history interviews, quite an extensive number of them, and fortunate that we did when we did because some of the elders have since passed, and we were able to capture very beneficial information from them in these interviews. We commissioned some custom maps based on archival information that we were able to obtain. And I have to tell you just one funny story. So some of you here, I imagine, have done research in the archives of the Huntington Library in San Marino. And the Huntington Library, in addition to having an archive that they've digitized of all the Spanish mission records, which was a huge help to us, also had a lot of personal papers and other documents, court records and so on, that we were interested in reviewing. So Dwayne and I went to the Huntington. We requested access to their archival material, and he was granted access right away. I, however, was not. Now, this is while I'm Vice Chancellor Academic Personnel. I just want to add that fact in there. The reason I was not given immediate access to the Huntington Library archives was because my highest degree is a JD and not a PhD. So I needed letters of support from 2 people with PhDs before the Huntington Library would allow me access to their archives, which fortunately I was able to do. One of them was in my very own household. But I just thought it was pretty odd that someone in my role in the university, in relation to so many people with PhDs, nonetheless needed their support just to get this research information. So I'm going to now share screen and provide you with a number of visuals, and also obviously give you a lot of the background and information associated with them. The book that we produced as a result of all this work has the title that you have up there in purple, A Coalition of Lineages, the Fernandino Tataviam Band of Mission Indians. And I put a link, actually 2 links. They're both going to the same place, but one is much more cumbersome than the other. If you're interested in the book is about to come out any day. Dwayne and I have already gotten advanced copies. It's available in hardcover, in ebook, and also in paperback. And we are very excited to be able to announce this. So the first visual that I'm providing to you is a map of the area from which different indigenous groups were brought to Mission San Fernando, which is located today in the city of San Fernando. And one of the big obstacles to the federal recognition of California tribes has been the fact that the federal government and many other people have a preconceived notion of what a tribe is. They think of it as maybe some large centralized group, maybe subgroups within it, but definitely some large centralized group. And you'll see in this map that we have shown in, with the dotted lines dividing them, a series of large type names, which are basically linguistic groups: Serrano, Tataviam, Catanamuk, Fernandino, obviously, and Gabrielino. These are Spanish impositions, but they're referring to linguistic, indigenous linguistic groups. And then the Ventureño are Chumash people on to the west. There is no one Serrano or Tataviam or Ventureño or Catanamuk tribe. There never was. There were hundreds of villages scattered throughout this area in Southern California. And we've shown in this map only a sampling of them. These villages would have had between, say, 200 and 500 people. If they got bigger, they would have to break off into others. What's notable about each of these villages is that each one was grounded in a single lineage. That is, all of the people in that village trace their ancestry to a common ancestor. There might be people, and there would have to be people married in from other villages. Those people would keep their lineage association with their lineage of birth. Even though they might be living in the village they were married into, they would not become a member of that village. Okay. Each of these lineages in what are the gray shaded linguistic groups, which are, as you can see in the bottom box, Uto-Aztecan language groups. These were patrilineal lineages. That is, they took their membership through common ancestry from a male ancestor. Okay. And it was the males who were the members and the women who married in. To the west, in the Ventureño, the angle shaded territory, that is Hokan, primarily Chumash speaking territory. This was territory settled actually before the Uto-Aztecan territory. It often is said to have gone back 8,000 to 10,000 years. This Ventureño Chumash territory was matrilineal. That is, those villages trace their ancestry to a common female ancestor. In the patrilineal villages, leadership tended to be male. In the matrilineal villages, leadership was more often female than in the others. And you can only imagine some of the issues that came up with intermarriage, right? So if a Chumash or Ventureño speaking female from a matrilineal lineage married into one of the patrilineal lineages, she would maintain her membership in her Ventureño lineage. And the problem would be that normally in a matrilineal lineage, the husband goes to live with the wife, and in a patrilineal lineage, the wife goes to live with the husband. So in this circumstance, there would have had to have been some kind of negotiation. Maybe they alternated. I'm not sure exactly how they managed it, but it was an interesting challenge. Now, each of these lineage-based villages was autonomous politically. There was no leader from any other village who would be recognized within the village. The Spanish referred to these leaders as captains, and we use that phrase going forward because the tribe itself continues to use it. But each one was politically autonomous. Now, that said, there was a lot of interaction among these villages. Of course, for marriage purposes, otherwise there would be inbreeding, but also for ceremonial purposes, for trade purposes. So there were many reasons why these different lineage-based villages would interact with one another, but it was always on a voluntary basis. It was never something that was compelled by any central authority. And I think you can begin to understand the origins of the title of our book from this explanation, because we refer to the present day tribe as a coalition of lineages, as a voluntary association of the descendants of many of these lineages. And the second of our slides is going to show you many of these same villages in relation to present day landmarks, just so you can see. And some of these names are going to sound very familiar to you. You're going to see Tujunga, for example, or you may also see, Cahuenga down towards the south. Siutkanga is actually the site of present day Encino. And the closest lineage village to Mission San Fernando and the city of San Fernando is the one called Pasenga, which is in the middle, or close to the middle. But you can see down in the bottom left, the village of Maliwul, which today we refer to as Malibu, and quite a few of the others that were all brought in to Mission San Fernando. And this is a drawing that was made by one of the leaders of the Fernandino Tataviam band of Mission Indians, Larry Ortega, of what one of these villages might have looked like. I don't know if any of you have ever been out to the the Chumash village in Malibu that is operated by the Wistoyo Foundation, a nonprofit which I should confess I serve as president. But we have recreated a Chumash village on that site, and the housing looks very similar to what you see in this drawing. That is the tule reeds on the outside and the willow branches forming the structure on the inside. And keep this image in mind because you're going to see another recreation of a village site at the very end of this presentation. I thought it would be useful to share with you a map of the missions that were founded in what was called by Mexico Alta California. Of course, they had Baja California as well, the peninsula. But something worth noting is that Mission San Fernando, Rey de España, which is number 17, about near to the bottom, is one of the very late missions established. It's not established until 1797, and it was established in large part because of the distance between the San Gabriel mission and the next closest mission at San Buenaventura. It was just a very far trip to go from one to the other. San Fernando Rey de España being established so late, keep in mind, is operating as a mission in full force, really, only for about 35 years. And this will become relevant when I talk about the whole question of how effective these missions were in undertaking their goal of basically forced assimilation and transformation of the indigenous people of this area. Okay. I thought it might be interesting to show you an image of the altar after it was restored at Mission San Fernando in all its golden glory. We actually opened the book with the scene of a marriage that takes place between prominent lineage members from two different lineages, young people who are joined together in marriage at Mission San Fernando. We talk a lot about the community that was present for this marriage ceremony. And then we switch later on in that same introduction to the book to a time about 165 years later, when the then leader of the Fernandino Tataviam band of Mission Indians passes away, and there is a funeral ceremony for him on the grounds of this self-same mission. And we point out all the descendants of the people who were at the marriage ceremony in 1845. One thing worth noting about Mission San Fernando is its huge expanse. This is another one of the one of the maps that we commissioned, and it shows the approximate boundaries of Mission San Fernando as of 1827. And you can see some markings, particularly the LA River and where Encino is located, the location of the mission buildings, but also the very large expanse. Mission San Fernando was one of the most productive missions in the entire California system. It was producing not only for its own residents, but it was also supplying a lot of the food and other needs of the military and the government that were maintained first by Spain, and then after Mexican independence in 1821 by Mexico. Keep in mind that there was no taxation for any of the private property owners that were granted ranches or ranchos in California. There was really no revenue for the state except what was being produced by these missions. And so this territory, as you can also imagine, is in an area which has later become so extraordinarily and exceptionally valuable. And this was a detriment to the Fernandino Tataviam band of Mission Indians, because when the federal government late in the 19th century, early in the 20th century, tried to make amends for harms to Mission Indians and began allocating some lands to former Mission Indians. They were not about to allocate any of the lands in this area because it was just way too expensive to acquire it. All right, so these missions were established initially by Spain as a temporary measure. So the Spanish government claimed all of the land of California for the Spanish king with authorization, of course, from papal authorities, but their purpose ostensibly was to hold these mission lands for the purpose of converting and assimilating the Indians, after which a small portion of that land would be allocated to the Indians for their agricultural purposes because they would have been turned into farmers. And they would be granted some of that territory for a town or pueblo, a municipality within Spanish government that would have some limited self-governing powers, just as any municipality would have, subject to the greater authority. The Indians in the Southern California area, and actually throughout California, were not farmers at the time of contact with Europeans. In that way, they were different from many of the indigenous groups in South America, for example, that were engaged in agricultural pursuits of a very sophisticated sort. The indigenous people in California are described as hunter-gatherers, but they were anything but passive in relation to their natural surroundings. They used burning, they used thinning, they used lots of mechanisms to encourage the production of acorns and other foods and medicines that they needed to ensure adequate supplies of game. There was a great deal of fishing available. So while they were not by any means passive in relation to their natural surroundings, they were not farmers. So there was a job to be done by the missionaries in the missionaries and in the Spanish government's view to transform them into farmers, which would result in a reduction of their lands, not an entire dispossession, but definitely a tremendous reduction in the amount of territory so that the remainder could be occupied and exploited by Spanish and then later Mexicans. And I see the word should be secularization with a Z in there. So in 1821, Mexico achieves some independence from Spain. There is immense turmoil within Spain as between different within Mexico, as between different factions, some of which wanted to have what they would have called a very liberal regime of independence from the church and elimination of the more aristocratic structures that had existed under Spanish rule. Others within the Mexican government were closer to the church, closer to landed classes, but the push was for secularization of the missions, meaning that they would move ahead with this plan to reduce the indigenous lands and also to remove the role of the missionaries who had been in charge of these missions and to replace them with parish priests. So reduce land for the indigenous people, pueblos with some self-governing municipal authority, and parish priests substituted for the missionaries in charge, and then lots more land to be granted to Mexican citizens. And this is decreed in 1835 and carried out more or less, depending upon who was in ascendance within the turmoil in Mexican government. The Fernandino Indians, those who had been brought to Mission San Fernando and were living there, were definitely aware of what was going on, that the Mexican government was very eager to achieve this secularization. And the local Mexican population in California wanted to take it even further. So they wanted to dispossess, ignore the rights, any rights of the indigenous people altogether, and parcel out all of the mission lands to local, what they were calling Californios. These were Mexican citizens who were living in California. And whenever the central Mexican government tried to push back on that and to protect the potential rights of the Mission Indians, there were some very serious skirmishes, and some of these governors sent by the central Mexican government actually got run out of town because the locals were so interested in getting their hands on what they perceived rightly to be very valuable land in this area. So the Fernandinos at the mission decided that if they were going to salvage anything under these circumstances, they needed to get some grants from the Mexican government as well. One of the things we were able to find in our archival searches was a diseño, a map deed that was presented to 40 Fernandino Mission Indians who had petitioned then governor of Mexican California, Mitchell Terena, for a tract of land. And this was a square league that was deeded to them by Governor Mitchell Terena. And you can see how it was done in those days, very much through drawing rather than through language. One of the interesting features of this grant is that it was provided to the Fernandinos as a group. This reinforces our notion that this is a tribe, not just a bunch of individuals. And a provision in the deed was that the land could not be sold or otherwise alienated by this group. So it was definitely intended to be a homeland for the Fernandinos. And we were able to find actually a list of the 40 petitioners in our archival searches. We thought you might want to see yet another one of these diseños deeds. This is for Cahuenga, the tract known as Cahuenga, which is also the name of a lineage village, as you saw. And this was given in 1845 to Jose Miguel Triunfo as a grant to him personally. Typically, where these were made to Fernandinos as individuals, these were people who had performed considerable service to the mission. And this will show you a whole host of these land grants that were made during the very tail end of Mexican period in California. One up in, you can see the grant to the 40 petitioners, also one at Tujunga, the other at Encino, the traditional village known as Sutcanga. Many of these were within the boundaries of the mission, but a few were on the edges as well. And this will show you an adobe that was built on the property of the Encino grant by one of the men who came to the descendants of the grantee, of the native grantee, and helped out when there was a problem with a potential inability to pay taxes. And this guy, De La Osa, became a part owner of this tract of land. The rancho was owned by a woman by the name of Maria Rita Alipez, who is the woman who was married at the wedding ceremony I was telling you about in 1845. And she is an ancestor of present-day leaders of the Fernandino Tataviam band of Mission Indians. This is a name that you're probably pretty familiar with, Pio Pico, the last Mexican governor of California. Pio Pico is not a hero to the Fernandinos. Pio Pico decided in the waning days of the Mexican rule, as war with America, the United States, was impending, that he was going to actually grant the mission lands to a man by the name of Eulogio de Silas. Pio Pico had previously rented it to his brother, Andres Pico, but he sold the entire mission land to Eulogio de Silas, ostensibly to raise money to fight the war with the United States, although very little was allocated for that purpose. But the important thing for our purposes is that the grant completely ignored the grants that you've already seen, including the one to the 40 petitioners. It was just taking it right out from under them. Now, when the United States takes over through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, there was some potential for the situation of the Mission Indians to be improved legally. Keep in mind that the Spanish had already committed one dispossession by claiming all of that land for the King of Spain, subject to the missionaries' management of that land for future partial, very partial benefit of the Indian people. There was a second dispossession when Pio Pico and other Mexican governors make private land grants to non-native peoples like de Silas of the very lands that are the ancestral territories of these indigenous groups. Now comes the United States. The United States has a body of federal Indian law that could have been invoked to rectify or improve the position of the Mission Indians. And I can't go into enormous detail about this. You'd have to take my federal Indian law class, which I'm not even teaching anymore. But US federal Indian law recognizes what it calls aboriginal title to ancestral lands that have never been voluntarily abandoned. And the village lands of these lineages were never voluntarily abandoned by these groups. So arguably, they had aboriginal title to a considerable amount of this territory. But there were several problems that arose. So normally, under federal Indian law, when the United States wants to extinguish aboriginal title and make land available for private ownership, the United States would make treaties with the Indians. This is where the word reservation comes from. The tribes would reserve part of their aboriginal or ancestral lands for their own homelands, and then they would cede the remainder of their aboriginal territory to the United States, which could then make it available for other purposes. Okay. And in keeping with that understanding, the United States actually sent treaty commissioners to California in 1851 to begin negotiating treaties with the California tribes. And they did negotiate. They negotiated 18 treaties with California tribes that set aside 7.5 million acres of land as homelands for those tribes. Of course, these treaties had to be ratified by the United States Senate. That's provided in the US Constitution. Those treaties went to the United States Senate, and the California congressional delegation, which had passed resolutions urging the United States government to remove all of the indigenous people from California, who knows where, And of course, this is a period of time when the state of California is funding militias to go out and murder California Indians in what a UCLA history professor, Ben Madley, has described quite rightly as genocide. This congressional legislation from California went to the US Senate and prevented the ratification of the 18 treaties that had been negotiated between 1851 and 1853. One of those treaties would have reserved lands in a part of the ancestral territory of Fernandino Indians, mainly around what is present-day Tejon Ranch. The Indians who signed that treaty were from that area. They were asked to cede a much larger tract of land, and you can see it described in this map as ceded land. They had no rights to it at all. The idea that they could cede something that they had no ancestral territory for is a fiction that the United States government created in order to have clean, what they perceived as clean title to all of this land. In any event, the treaty never got ratified, so no territory, no 7.5 million acres were set aside for the Indians of California. And the treaties themselves were hidden. They weren't actually brought to light until around 1915. So they were basically hidden away because they were considered an embarrassing feature of the legal landscape. The native folks who had negotiated in good faith in these treaties were never told, they were never ratified. And so many of them moved out of territories thinking that they had ceded them, and later found out that they had no rights to any territory whatsoever under these treaties. Now, another problem arose because the United States had provided in the treaty with Mexico that they would recognize and respect all of the private property rights that had existed previously under Mexican law. And so a question arose immediately upon American rule. What would be the status of some of these land grants that had been made by Pio Pico and others to non-natives in relation to the Mission Indians? Well, the United States early on created a California Land Commission. And they said in that legislation that anyone who had a right to, or claimed they had a right to land under Mexican law prior to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo would have to come to a land commission and in California, Northern California, and prove up their rights with appropriate documentation and get their rights confirmed by this commission. And any land that was not confirmed by this commission would become public land of the United States. There was a provision in this legislation that said a commission should be established to inquire into and affirm where appropriate the rights of the Mission Indians. The United States never created that commission. So they went ahead and approved land grants like the one to Eulogio de Silas from Pio Pico for the entire San Fernando Mission, without taking into consideration any of the rights that might exist of the Mission Indians. So they were entirely out as a result of this. So we refer to 3 dispossessions for the Fernandinos: by Spain, through claiming the land for the King of Spain; by Mexico, through the land grants made by Pio Pico and other governors; and by the United States, through the failure to ratify the treaties and through the enactment of this Land Commission law. It gets worse. But I thought, we thought you'd like to see a drawing that we found of San Fernando Mission as of 1856. You can see that the mission is pretty much the only action in town. here is an image of one of the most important leaders of the Fernandinos in the late 19th century and even into the very early 20th century, named Rogerio Rocha. Rocha was one of the young signatories of the petition of the 40s for that land grant. His father was a leader of his lineage, and Rogerio was a leader of his as well. He had some land that he was occupying even after the US took over. He was even paying taxes on that land and cultivating it. He was a very skilled silversmith. He had mastered the ceremonies of the Catholics and could perform those ceremonies. You know, one of the things that we ascertained through our research was that the missionaries were largely unsuccessful in their attempts to forcefully and fully transform and assimilate the native peoples at Mission San Fernando. Part of it was they didn't have a whole lot of time. Part of it is something that we detail at the very beginning of the book, which is that their worldviews, their belief systems, their social systems, their practices were very, very different from a Christian belief system. Not only their forms of economy, but also their understandings of spirituality, of this worldly versus otherworldly existence. Even though there were variations, considerable ones in some instances among the Chumash and the Takic speakers, all of them were quite different from the Catholic worldview. And what happened for most of these indigenous folks, and Rogerio is a good example of them, is that they became bicultural. They practiced where it was expected, the Catholic ceremonies. They acquired the skills of agriculture and, in his case, silversmithing, but they were also very skilled in, you know, all of the other crafts that were needed for life on the California frontier in those days, candle making and so on, cart making. But they did not abandon their traditional languages, their traditional ceremonial practices. We have evidence of some of these ceremonies being practiced into the 1860s and 1870s. They did not abandon their understandings of life and death and nature. And Rogerio is a very good example of this kind of bicultural existence. Beginning in the late 1870s, those developers who acquired land from Decilis began to want to really make economic use of this land in the San Fernando Valley. And there were still people like Rogerio Rocha and the group that he was a part of and leading, who were still occupying that land. It was their ancestral territory. So we were able to find court records of numerous proceedings brought to eject or evict these Indians from their own ancestral territory. It became a kind of cause célèbre in the Los Angeles newspapers. You can see this as a headline from the Los Angeles Star, or the Herald, excuse me, in 1896. But the actions that they're talking about took place in the late 1870s initially. And Rogerio and his group were thrown out onto the road in the mud, and his wife died. It was really pretty horrific. The United States actually commissioned some lawyers to help respond to these eviction actions in the 1870s, and later to try to rectify this in the 1880s and 90s. And in fact, we used the fact that the United States engaged these lawyers as a demonstration of the United States having recognized a relationship to this tribe. This was a drawing that appeared in the Herald of the home that Rogerio was living in Lopez Canyon after his eviction. And this image we thought that was great. It shows you exactly how valuable this land was and how eager people were for the riches that would come from developing it. And you know, some of the names that we know of as you know, names of some notoriety in Southern California, like Porter, for example, Porter Ranch. These are our villains in the story, because these are the folks achieving the evictions that are happening here. You know, one of the things, I'm getting close to the end of this, but one of the things that is notable about the book that we've done is that it doesn't end the story of the Mission Indians with the end of the mission. That's where most of the research on Mission Indians has been. Our goal has been to demonstrate the continuity of these peoples through the decades up to the present. And although there was much loss of population and the numbers were down to a very small group around by 1900, some of these individuals who survived wound up having large families, and their descendants who view themselves as part of a common lineage are the core and the mainstay of the Fernandino Tataviam band of Mission Indians today. And there are three main lineages which are identified by names that are Spanish because they are lineages that were sustained by female members of lineages who married out. And so the names of their out-married Spanish named husbands are the names of these lineages, but they are definitely part of the Fernandino Tataviam village lineage group. So Francis and Fred Cooke, these were continuing leaders of one of the lineages that is largely identified today with Chumash villages, and the name is Garcia today for that lineage. And Mary Cooke is one of the children of this group. Another was Antonio Maria Ortega, the grandson, the son of Maria Rita Alipis, who was the woman married at the altar. And these are his some of his many grandchildren. Then the third of these lineages today is descendants of Jose Miguel Triunfo, whose daughter took the name Ortiz when she married out, and here are some of the Ortiz lineage members. Antonio Maria Ortega's grandson, Rudy Ortega Sr., was very instrumental in organizing the tribe in a very active way, beginning in the middle of the 20th century. And cultural resource protection was a big cause of his. And here he is at a site at Rocketdyne, protecting a site of cave paintings. And on the far left, again, is Rudy Ortega Sr. They created a nonprofit to provide scholarships to deserving students as part of the tradition within the tribe of caring for the community. Here's Charlie Cooke, a captain in the Garcia lineage, who was a very active local Chumash leader. Some of you may have known him. And here's Charlie with Rudy Ortega Sr.'s son, Rudy Ortega Jr. This will show you some of the interaction between these lineages. They're very much connected to one another. Here's Ted Garcia, the successor to Charlie Cooke, another one of the leaders of the community. And finally, the president of the tribe today, Rudy Ortega Jr., here he is at the recreation of a village site at what is now Camelos Ranch in the Northern Valley. And you can see the symbol of the tribe in front of the podium. The tribe is consisting of people who can trace their lineage ancestry to someone who was at Mission San Fernando. So there's a collectivity associated with the mission, as well as the connections among the various lineages. Whether or not this tribe receives federal recognition, it will continue through its nonprofit activities, through its relationships with local governments, and also even the federal government, to carry on its important work of maintaining culture and maintaining community. But federal recognition would advance them in an important way. And I don't just mean some people associate it with gaming. This particular tribe was seeking federal recognition long before Indian gaming was on the horizon. And it is by no means their primary consideration. Cultural resource protection, child welfare, and a host of other benefits for health and education go along with federal recognition. So I will actually stop there and thank you all for your patience listening to me.
Well, thank you so much, Carole. That was so interesting as a kind of new Angelino to see how these names kind of come about from the different tribes and the missions. So let me, okay, so everyone, you have the ability to unmute. Please feel free to either type something into the chat for a question. We have our first question. So Daniel wants to know what Tongva, what is that exactly?
Okay, so Tongva is a currently contested term. It is most certainly a linguistic term rather than the name of a single large tribe. In fact, there are quite a few Tongva speaking villages in the Southern California area. At least one of the groups in this area does not like the term Tongva at all to refer to them and prefers the term quiche. So I generally do my best to refer to village names whenever I can, rather than to these linguistic terms. The closest Tongva speaking village to UCLA is called Curravungna. And some of you may have been there. They've long held what they used to call before Columbus Day events. Now there isn't, I guess it's Indigenous Peoples Day. But there is a beautiful natural springs on the site of currently University High School, which has been restored and is now maintained by a Curravungna nonprofit group. And they have a cultural center that's sometimes open and available to the public. Their hunting and gathering territory almost certainly would have included UCLA, but there was no village site on what is now UCLA campus.
I have another kind of question before I do the chats, but I remember, I think 2019, Chancellor Block started having where any sort of public speech that was going on, we had to acknowledge the UCLA as a public and land grant institution to acknowledge the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples. So how did that come about with having to kind of recognize the land that we're on in recognition with the tribes?
Well, that is a relatively recent movement that has taken hold, not just here, but in many, many parts of the United States. And I think it was activism by folks, students and faculty and staff and alums associated with UCLA. I think what is important is to see the word peoples in there. So, you know, I'm involved in a variety of ways at the moment with this recognition and naming issue. I'm serving on the campus-wide committee that Chancellor Block formed to deal with issues of honorific naming and unnaming. And one of the issues that has come up is the what we often refer to as the Jantz Steps, but for which there is no official designation as Jantz Steps. Search as you may, you will not find a plaque or any acknowledgement that that's the name. But there's been a petition from students to rename it as the Tongva Steps. And there's been some controversy within the community about whether that's the right name to use or whether it should be, for example, called the Curravangna Steps, because that's the closest village to this site. So this is very much in play, but keep in mind that with all of the villages that would have been drawn to Mission San Gabriel, and that's where the Gabrielino comes from, just as Fernandino is what the Spanish called the indigenous people at Mission San Fernando, Gabrielino is what they call the indigenous people at Mission San Gabriel. But there were so many villages, each one autonomous. To this day, their descendants form autonomous communities. There's no particular reason why they feel obligated to agree with one another. And so there can readily arise differences of opinion about something as specific as a name like Tongva.
Okay, we have, I think, 5 more questions in the chat. Are individuals eligible for the special recognition in the ACA as are others, such as the Cherokee?
You mean the Affordable Care Act? Is that what ACA?
Julie, what are you referencing as far as ACA? Let me see, where's Julie? I don't see Julie, so maybe she left. I don't understand what her question meant, so we can skip that one.
Okay.
Let's see. So the next question would be, should the name of the park in Santa Monica be changed?
Oh, that's something that's got to be negotiated with the communities. Good heavens. That's certainly not my call.
Okay. There is a Sister Elsie on street, our Sister Elsie, our street is named after her in Tujunga. We live at the slopes of Mount Lukens, which is previously called Sister Elsie Peak. Anything you have come across Sister Elsie who was told working with the Tongva?
No, but I'm going to get on it right away. Thank you for that.
Well,
that was you that asked that question, Haratune?
Yeah. There's also the Tongva Peak, which is on the Verdugo at 2,400 feet high.
Yeah.
And recently it has been, renovated or some construct done there by the Scouts. So we hike all around this area on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And there is also a Sister Elsie trail, which is almost destroyed now, which goes all the way to Mount Lukens. Unfortunately, Mount Lukens was a government official, and they changed the name some decades ago from Sister Elsie to Mount Lukens. I don't know what governments do, but people around our district are very unhappy about not calling it Sister Elsie.
Yeah.
It's mythical. We have our own mythology.
Well, let me tell you what I think is one of the consequences of the use of the word Tongva. It conveys the notion that there's a single tribe that's Tongva. And when any of these different communities seeks federal recognition, the federal government shares the view that why aren't you all together as one group? And when they're not all together as one group, which they never really were, except when they were forced to be at the mission, the federal government says, well, you haven't shown continuity. you haven't shown that you were all one group before, and where is everybody together now, and you're a bunch of factions, and you can't see eye to eye, and it has been a very detrimental thing. So as long as everybody understands that Tongva is not one single big centralized group, it's fine to use that term. It's just that it's got to be understood within the historical context.
Right. So Julie, do you want to elaborate on your question about the ACA?
I just wondered if, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I wondered, I've heard that, I wonder what, I wonder about the federal status. It looks like they're not federally recognized. I do know that when people apply for Affordable Care Act, they're asked if they're Native American. I know somebody who was asked that and said yes and got something special because of that. And I wondered if it makes a difference for these people.
Yes. Yes, and I'm not sure exactly whether you would view it as a benefit or not. Because if they are members of federally recognized tribes, they are eligible for health care through the Indian Health Service, which is a notoriously underfunded source of medical care. So my guess is that if you are eligible for Indian Health services, they want to view any Affordable Care Act benefits as supplemental to those rather than starting from the very beginning of your entitlement.
My friend ended up getting USC coverage through the Affordable Care Act because he was Native American.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could well be. But in California, this particular group is not federally recognized, so I don't think they would be treated in that same fashion.
Okay. The next question is a very interesting talk. Thank you, Carole. Wondering whether any cultural practices or languages have come down today continuously or whether they have been reviewed by contemporary interest. Are the languages interesting with the two groups in the old days? How close were the languages? Were they mutually understandable? Did many people speak more than their own language?
Well, I obviously don't have this from firsthand access, but it's pretty evident to me that if Chumash speaking villages are intermarrying with Takac speaking villages, which they most certainly were, we have lots of evidence of that from the mission records. Good Lord, they would have had to figure out how to speak to one another. So my guess is very strongly that these are multilingual people, and even among the Takac speakers, there were, some variations in the speech forms. Have the languages come down? Well, one of our UCLA Emeriti, Pam Monroe, has been very active with Tongva speakers, and that would be close to the people that we call the language Gabrielino in the map that I showed you. The Santa Ynez Band of Chumash, which is the only federally recognized Chumash group, actually went to a linguist who had studied Chumash language, working with tapes that were made by the famous early 20th century linguist John Harrington, and created a Chumash English Chumash dictionary, which is an amazing thing. Does it account for every dialect of Chumash? No. We were trying to identify as much of the linguistic heritage that had been retained by the Fernandino Tataviam band of Mission Indians, and there was an immense amount of language loss, immense amount. There are certain things that have been retained, some of them very helpful to us in our research. For example, the language terms associated with leadership. So we were able to learn that words like Tomir or Tomar were associated with leadership roles. And when we went back to the mission records, we could see individuals who were baptized or married who had names that had the word Tomir in them. And today, the leaders of the Fernandino Tataviam Band of Mission Indians are referred to as Tomir and not just as captain. So there are some terms that have been sustained over time, but there has been a lot of language loss also.
Okay, the next question is, Tongva Village at University High is opening in the morning of the first Saturday of every month. I was much moved by my visit. What kind of assistance do the current tribal efforts require?
You mean at that particular village or in general? I'm not sure.
I think they were just, I think, Steve, you were just saying about the university is opening, and then this is a separate question about what kind of assistance do they have?
Well, you know, the Fernandino Tataviam have been an exceedingly enterprising group. So they created a nonprofit. So things that they weren't able to accomplish by virtue of having a government-to-government relationship with the United States, they were sometimes able to accomplish through this nonprofit form of organization. So they've used that, for example, to be part of the system of distributing food resources and to partake of educational opportunities. One of the things that maybe this group would be particularly interested in is that the state of California has extended repatriation rights for non-federally recognized California tribes. So this is rights to achieve the return of ancestors and cultural items that are held in institutions in the state of California, including, of course, the University of California. And one of the things I've been very occupied with of late, and make sure this winds up in the catalog of service by Emeriti, is I've been serving on a UC system-wide committee to entirely revise and re-envision UC's repatriation policy in light of this new legislation. So what I would say is more of the tribes need the kind of research support and assistance that Dwayne and I have been giving to the Fernandino Tataviam, but also to take advantage of some of the experiences that the Fernandino Tataviam have had. They have actually acquired a certain amount of renown among folks who do work in Native Nation building around the world, because the Fernandino Tataviam are an example of a non-federally recognized group that has nonetheless been able to pursue community welfare and cultural resource protection. The Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, which does a lot of technical assistance and training for federally recognized tribal governments, is interested because they do work, for example, with Aboriginal peoples in Australia and in other parts of the world where there are no federal recognition arrangements for anybody, any groups. And to see how the Fernandino Tataviam have navigated their status to advance themselves as indigenous peoples is providing a template or an example for other groups as well.
Yeah. Okay.
And restoring land, I mean, you want to know help? Land bases, that would be huge.
Okay. You also have a few more other questions. Haratune, do you want to talk about Sister Elsie who lived in the early 20th century? Do you want to elaborate on that?
No. I mean, there is some information on the about Sister Elsie that you can Google it, and some of my colleagues have already done that. But that's the more research needs to be done about this person. Very interesting about his mythology, which is around, lives around Tahanga area.
This could prove very, very useful to us, because one of the criteria for federal recognition is labeled under the federal regulations as external recognition, meaning if the group has been acknowledged by outside observers, and Sister Elsie would doubtless count as one, if any of her work demonstrates a certain amount of acknowledgement that there is an indigenous group, that could be very helpful. So I'm really going to follow up on this. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions? We're just at 2:45, so if you have any other questions, please feel free to go ahead and raise your hand and just, you have one, is it Andy?
Yeah. Hi, Carol. It's Andy Kelly.
Great.
Hi. Listen, I've heard before that the Tongva people language was Shoshone, but I see now that you classify it with the Utes and the Aztecs, which seems like a huge area for one language family. But and I've also read that they came down from the Nevada area about 3 millennia ago and pushed in on the Chumash. Is that what's the history of that, do you think?
Well, they definitely are more recent arrivals.
Mhm.
I don't know if you would say they pushed onto them. You know, being exiled to Malibu is not exactly a bad thing. In fact, I used to joke that when a Chumash woman married a, let's say a Tataviam male, and you know, they would have this conflict, like she says we're supposed to go to my village and he says we're supposed to go to my village. The resolution would always be in her favor because she was on the beach, but who knows? So the Takac languages are, that's maybe a subgroup of the Uto-Aztecan that is the one that is often associated with these speakers. And maybe Shoshonean fits into that. I'm not the linguistic expert in the pair with my husband, but the Takac would often be the term that would be used as the umbrella for these languages.
I see. Okay. How do you spell Takac?
T-A-K-I-C.
Okay. Good, thank you. That's really.
But you know, Serrano, Luceño, these are all variants of Takac languages.
But you would classify the Indians, the main classification would be from St. Gabriel, would be Gabriel Leño?
Well, that's certainly the title that the Spanish would give them. You know, the Mission San Luis Rey. So those Indians were called Luceño. It's just a variant on the name of the mission.
Right.
When all of these people from different lineage villages were jammed together at these missions, they did develop a certain common experience, a certain common identity, having experienced the mission together. And that's one of the arguments that we're making in this book and on behalf of the Fernandino Tataviam, that this coalition of lineages is reflected also in this more common identity of Fernandino. And that's why the name of the tribe that they chose was Fernandino Tataviam. So they acknowledge a village or a linguistic group, but they also acknowledge this common experience and identity.
What affected the Pueblo, the very early Pueblo at the Queen of the Angels there in Los Angeles River? What effect did that have upon the Indians?
Well, if you want to talk about after the mission, more so, because many of the Indians who left Mission San Fernando after secularization in the 1830s, many of them came to the Pueblo of Los Angeles because that's where they could find work. And many of you may be aware that when the state of California began enacting laws, they had a form of indenture, almost slavery. If you were an Indian in the state and you were found not to have current employment, you could be jailed, and then whoever bailed you out was entitled to your services. Yeah, so there was the common understanding of California is that we became a free state, meaning that African slavery was not part of our legal form, but indigenous slavery was.
Wow, I didn't know that. Wow, it's amazing.
So Carole, I think we have probably time for one or two more questions. Can you give me again the name of your book or type it in the chat, and then I can share it with everyone else and put it on our YouTube channel?
Okay, hang on.
And where we can find it?
Okay, so let me go back to my original, see if I can copy it and then do it again. How's that? And then I'll do a chat to everyone. Let's see, chat.
And if you have a hard copy, I'll be glad to get one to have it at our office.
Well, as soon as I get one, you can have it.
Diane, did you have a question while Carole's looking for that?
Your
I see
turn.
something you're hanging up. What does that say? We can't see it, Diane. You have to unmute first.
Okay, and the title is A Coalition of Lineages, the Fernandino Tataviam Band of Mission Indians.
And that is in the chat. So I'll also send out a follow-up email to everyone here. Do you want to share your presentation with me, Carole? And I can send that to everyone that's here, and I can share also
Yes.
the YouTube link where we're going to save this and archive it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
There are about 56 images in this book. So we did a lot of collecting, some of it very fortunately provided to us by the tribe.
Fantastic. Okay, Diane, do you want to tell us what you were holding up after you unmute?
It was the title of the book that I'd written on my note paper.
Oh, God. Okay, thank you. So once I send this out, I'll make sure I include that for everyone. Any other questions?
I have a quick question. The Southwest Museum has a Braun library. Have you had access to that?
Yes, and I did not have to get 2 letters from PhDs in order to get it.
Because you know they have the wax records of the different languages.
Yes. No, they had, and they actually had the private papers of the lawyer who was engaged by the federal government to represent the Fernandinos. So that was a useful record. You know, if we had oodles and oodles of time, I would share with you a lot about our sources. We had some really remarkable sources.
Yeah, I was the director of development for the Southwest Museum.
Oh, fantastic.
And Dwayne Champagne has a book, Native American Portrait of the Peoples, about 750 pages of the history of the people of Native America. It's a very good book.
Thank you for plugging my husband's book.
Very interesting. Okay, time for, I think, one final question before we let Carole have her afternoon back. Anybody? Oh, Henry, you have your hand up? Go ahead. Are you waving goodbye? What's happening?
Andy is waving goodbye.
Wait, you have to unmute first.
Yeah, no, I was just wanting to thank Carole for really very interesting talk.
And thank you all for the great questions and for Sister Elsie.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I think we'll conclude today's talk. Carole, thank you so much for being a part of this very interesting conversation with what's happening in our indigenous people's lands and kind of how we got to where we are today. Thank you, Steve, and also Michael Heaphy with Retirees Association for coordinating this. Be on the lookout for an email this afternoon with Carole's book name and also the PowerPoint slide that you had shared earlier. So with all that taken, I'll definitely wrap up today's program. So thank you all for being here. Have a great Friday Eve. and take care.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.
Thank you.